Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about something potentially very serious that's developing inside Russia, because Russians are pulling billions of dollars out of their banks. We're not talking about people queuing around the block and banks physically closing their doors. Well, not yet, anyway. Instead, what's happening has been described as a slow motion bank run. And the numbers are starting to become very interesting. Around $4.5 billion was withdrawn from the banking system in June. Another $7.3 billion came out in July. And then in the first half of August, Russians withdrew $3.4 billion. So we're now talking about billions and billions of dollars moving out of the banking system and into physical cash. And what's particularly interesting is why people are apparently doing this, because there are growing fears inside Russia that the Kremlin may eventually start looking at the enormous amount of money sitting in Russian bank accounts as another potential source of funding. And when you combine that with Russia's deteriorating government finances, increasing levels of bad debt, problems in the bond market, and an economy which is effectively ground to a halt, you can see why people are starting to get nervous. So in today's video, we're going to look at what's actually happening, look at all of the numbers, and talk about whether Russia is really moving towards a banking crisis. And most importantly, what that could mean for Russia's ability to continue funding the war in Ukraine. But before we get into all of those details, could I ask anybody that hasn't subscribed yet to please hit that red subscriber button? It doesn't cost you anything, it's not really a subscription, just shows that you're interested in these sort of videos. If you could also give me a thumbs up for this video, it will help promote it. And if you've got the option of hitting that little hype symbol, which is like a diamond with a bit of a swoosh on, it looks a bit like a tadpole, if you could hit that, then it will help promote this video to more people and put a smile on my face. Now, the first thing we need to understand is that this is not a traditional bank run. When we normally think about a bank run, we imagine thousands of people panicking, rushing to their local branch and demanding all of their money immediately. That's not what's actually happening here. This is much slower, but potentially much more significant, because cash has been steadily leaking out of the Russian financial system. And according to figures reported from Russia's central bank, the amount withdrawn during 2026 has already surpassed the 2 trillion rubles that Russians withdrew back in 2022. And 2022 is obviously the year that Russia invaded Ukraine. Back then, there was a genuine panic. During the first 2 weeks alone following the invasion, around $23 billion was reportedly pulled out of the Russian banking system. The Kremlin then responded aggressively. Interest rates were pushed sharply higher to 20%, which was called an emergency level at the time. Capital controls were introduced, reducing the amount of money that could be moved, and the immediate panic eventually subsided. But what's interesting about the situation today is that Russia is in a very different financial position. 4 years of war are starting to leave scars, and the banking system has become an increasingly important part of the machine that's been financing the Russian wartime economy. The Kremlin needed huge amounts of money to dramatically increase military production of things like tanks, missiles, drones, ammunition, military equipment, and one way of doing that was through the banking system. Russian banks were effectively encouraged to provide enormous amounts of lending to businesses involved in strategic industries. And whilst that helped create enormous wartime industrial boom we've discussed many times on the channel, it's also created other problems. And the biggest one is debt. Lots of it. Russia's central bank says the total corporate lending portfolio has almost reached 87 trillion rubles, and overdue corporate debt stands at more than 3 trillion rubles. More importantly, that overdue debt has increased by around 13% over the last 12 months. And there are suggestions that the official figures might not actually tell us the full story. A European intelligence assessment reported recently that around 10% of Russian corporate loans are now considered to be doubtful, so probably not going to get paid back. And for some large banks, the proportion of problematic retail loans is as high as 15%. Now that is a significant figure, because banks don't simply get into trouble because they've made lots of loans. They get into trouble when people who borrowed the money can't actually pay it back. And we're starting to see evidence of that pressure. Sberbank, Russia's biggest bank, has already reduced its expectations for corporate lending after reporting worsening loan quality. more companies are apparently asking for their loans to be restructured. And that brings us to one of the biggest problems facing Russia right now: interest rates. Russia's official interest rate currently stands at 14%. Now, 14% might sound relatively low compared with where Russia has been, because it was up at 21%. But let's put it into context. 14% is still an extraordinarily high base rate. Businesses don't want to borrow at 14%. And when you think about it, if they do borrow money, they have to pay a margin above that for the bank's profit. So companies refinancing loans suddenly find themselves facing extremely expensive debt, maybe as high as 20% interest. Imagine you built your business model around borrowing money cheaply. You then took out a loan, you expanded, you invested, and suddenly that debt comes up for refinancing and your interest bill explodes. That can turn a perfectly viable business into a financially distressed business very quickly. We're already hearing warnings from inside Russia that some companies are effectively in a pre-default position. So Russian banks are being squeezed from one side by deteriorating loans, but they're now potentially being squeezed from the other side by depositors taking cash out. And this is where things become really interesting, because banks don't keep everybody's money sitting in a giant vault. If you put $10,000 into a bank, that money doesn't just sit there waiting for you to go in and claim it back. The bank uses deposits to make loans and buy investments. That's how banking works. They profit from your money. So if lots of people suddenly decide they want physical cash at exactly the same time, the bank then needs liquidity to be able to give it out. And one of Sberbank's most senior executives has publicly warned that these cash outflows are becoming a major problem. He said that if the current trend continues, things will get worse. And apparently, some Russian banks are now simply don't have enough spare cash available to buy Russian government bonds. And that's a big problem for the Kremlin, because Russia itself desperately needs money. The Russian Federation budget deficit for January through to July of 2026 has now reached 6.5 trillion rubles, which is around $76 billion. But the planned deficit for the entire year, the whole of 2026, was only 3.8 trillion. So after 7 months, Russia has already overshot the full year target by 70%. Just think about that. Russia planned to borrow 3.8 trillion rubles in this year, and after the first 7 months, they're already up to 6.5 trillion. And how does the Russian government finance that position? One of the main ways is by selling government bonds. But here's why the banking story joins the government finance story. Russian banks are the major buyer of those bonds, because there's nobody from overseas wanting to buy them. So if banks are suffering liquidity problems because customers are demanding physical cash, they have less money available to lend to the Russian government. And that's exactly what appears to be happening right now. Russia's finance ministry was forced to cancel planned bond auctions after demand weakened and borrowing costs rose dramatically. The yield on Russian 10-year government debt has now hit 17%, which for government debt is unbelievably high. And there's a very simple rule when you're borrowing money. The higher the interest rate, the more expensive the debt becomes. That's pretty obvious. Which means Russia potentially finds itself now caught in a vicious circle. The government needs more money, so it needs to borrow more, but investors demand higher interest rates. Higher rates hurt Russian companies. Those companies struggle to repay their bank loans. That creates more bad debt for the banks. Meanwhile, customers are now nervous and are withdrawing cash. That's reducing bank liquidity, which means banks have less money available to buy government bonds, which makes government borrowing even more difficult, and around we go. There is another reason that Russians may be getting nervous. The Kremlin has increasingly demonstrated that private property isn't necessarily private as some people might think. More than $50 billion worth of private Russian assets have reportedly been seized by the state as part of a nationalization drive. Businesses, mines, agricultural assets, and other major companies have changed hands. One Russian billionaire reportedly had around $7 billion of assets seized. And that's inevitably raised a question. If the Russian state desperately needs money, where does it go next? Because one politician has already suggested that the enormous pool of money held by Russians in bank accounts should somehow be mobilized to help solve Russia's economic problems. there's reportedly around 130 trillion rubles sitting in Russian bank accounts right now. Now, one thing's to be clear, that doesn't mean that the Kremlin has announced it's going to confiscate everybody's savings tomorrow. It hasn't done that yet. And even economists who are concerned about Russia say outright seizure of ordinary bank deposits is unlikely. But financial systems run on confidence. And if you believe that there's even a possibility that access to your money could be restricted in the future, what are you going to do? You're likely to take some of it out today. And this may explain why demand for physical cash is rising so rapidly in Russia. There are other reasons as well. Russian authorities have increasingly disrupted mobile internet services in an attempt to interfere with Ukrainian drone operations. But if your internet isn't working, your mobile payment systems may not work either. So Russians have another incentive to carry physical cash. The central bank itself has pointed to that factor. Now, in order to give you a balanced counter-argument, total household bank deposits actually increased slightly in July. So there isn't evidence that everybody in Russia is now emptying their bank accounts. And I think that's why the phrase slow motion bank run is interesting. Money is still flowing into the banking system, but at the same time, demand for physical cash has risen dramatically. The important issue isn't necessarily whether every depositor is fleeing, it's whether banks have enough liquid money available when the government also needs them to finance enormous levels of borrowing. And all of this is happening as Russia's wider economy is rapidly losing momentum. Economic growth in the first half of 2026 was only 0.3%. For comparison, growth in the same period of 25 was 1.2%. Russia's second largest bank, VTB, recently warned that economic growth for the whole year could be somewhere between 0 and 0.5%. So essentially stagnation. Investment is also under pressure. Capital investment fell by more than 14% in the first quarter of this year, and more than 500,000 Russians reportedly declared bankruptcy last year, an increase of over a third. Those aren't the numbers you would normally associate with a healthy, booming economy. And this is why the banking story matters, because Russia has managed to keep the wartime economy going much longer than people expected. Government spending has supported its factories, banks have supported those companies, companies have supported military production, and energy revenues have helped finance government spending. But after more than 4 years of war, each part of that chain is coming under increasing pressure. The budget deficit is exploding, banks are dealing with increasing bad debts, companies are dealing with extremely expensive borrowing, ordinary Russians are demanding more physical cash, and the government bond market, the mechanism Russia relies on to finance its deficit, is showing signs of strain. None of this means that Russia's banking system is about to collapse. The central bank still has powerful tools available to it. It can provide banks with liquidity, change reserve requirements, and intervene if necessary. And Russia's large banks continue to report profits. In July alone, Russia's banking sector generated more than 400 billion rubles of profit. So we shouldn't pretend that the entire financial system is bankrupt. It isn't. But banking crises rarely begin with someone switching the lights off and announcing that the system has collapsed. They develop when confidence weakens. Firstly, liquidity tightens, bad debts rise, borrowing costs increase, and every part of the financial system starts putting pressure on every other part. And that's what makes what's happening in Russia right now so interesting. The war isn't simply consuming tanks, ammunition, and soldiers, it's consuming money. And increasingly, the question for Russia isn't whether it can manufacture another missile, it's where the money to pay for that missile is going to come from. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking. That's what I'm here for, to get you to think about things in different ways. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. If you have the option and you see that funny little hype symbol, please hit that because it will help promote this video to more people. Thank you so much for watching this video all the way through to the end, and thank you to everyone that's supporting me. Genuinely appreciate it. If you bought me a coffee, amazing, thank you. If you've sent me a YouTube super thanks, that's incredible, really appreciate it. And if you've signed up as either a patron or a member, I genuinely appreciate that long-term support. That's what gets me out of the bed in the morning thinking, what am I going to make a video about today? Hoping to find something interesting for you, to try to share it with you and get you to see things slightly differently and understand what's going on rather than just reading the same headlines every day in the mainstream media. So thank you for your support, and I'll see you again next time.